Hello and welcome to today's Info2Go webinar, hosted by the Idaho Commission for Libraries with support from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. My name is Annie Gaines and I am a CE consultant here at the Idaho Commission for Libraries. Today we're going to be talking about restorative justice in libraries, and it is my pleasure to introduce John Thill, who is the Assistant Director at the Meridian Library District in Meridian, Idaho. So take it away, John.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this presentation today and being interested in this topic. I know it's been one that has been foremost in my mind for quite some time, and I'm happy that so many people are interested in it because I think it's a great tool for us in libraries that we can use to do the things we believe. And I'm gonna share my screen here so we can get in. I'm gonna give you a little background on where this began for us first. Meridian, we're a suburb of Boise in Idaho, and our location on Cherry Lane in Meridian is right across the street from a middle school. And I think that was a big driving factor for us in trying to start using restorative practices within our library. As you know, middle schools can be a very spirited bunch, and we typically would have about, before the pandemic, we had about 75 middle schoolers in our building every day after school. And so it did create some conflicts with other patrons and other types of youth during those times. And for us, what we ended up doing was thinking, we were having the same trouble with the same, 10 students every day. And these are kids that needed the library. They needed to be there until their parents picked them up from school. They were people that really found the library to be a refuge away from home in many cases. And so doing things like suspending them from the library for behavior issues, it just ended up being counterproductive. To suspend them meant they weren't able to interact with some of the more positive adults in their life. It meant that they weren't able to use services they needed to do homework. It really ended up being a counterintuitive thing. If we suspended kids for their behaviors, it just meant that they would take those behaviors elsewhere and they wouldn't have access to some of the positive elements of being in the library. And so with that, we started doing some research on restorative practices and how they might interact with library services. And it was interesting to look at that because a lot of times restorative practices are used in very kind of more closed communities like schools, or even in truth and reconciliation commissions and things like that, where there's a sort of set group of people and they all interact together over a period of time. Libraries are different than that because we have a lot of people coming and going. They don't have to stay, they don't have to be there. So it meant that there's some adjustments that need to be made to looking at how we can use this in a library setting. But with the help of the West Ada School District, who uses it in some of their locations, we were able to kind of come up with an outline of how we could use it in our facilities. And we've been doing this for about 1.5 years now. And it's really helped with some of the more intransigent issues we've had with certain patrons. And I think that is not just for youth, but also adults. And so with that, I'll kind of launch into it and we'll go into what it is, why we do it, and we'll give you some real nuts and bolts on how it's actually accomplished at our locations. All right, so you've all seen this probably, libraries are for everyone. It's a slogan we like to use, but I think for me, I like to call into question, do we actually mean it? And I think part of that is, if we're suspending people for small behavior issues or making it hard to use the library for them, does that really reflect this slogan and this belief that we have for our institutions? And I think, to me, restorative practices are part of where rubber meets the road for this. If we believe that it's a community resource open for everyone, then I think we need to also meet people where they are, even where their behaviors are concerned to some degree. All right, so Many of you may have heard of some ideas of restorative practice. You probably heard of, if you've heard of them at all, you probably heard of circles. And we'll talk a little bit about circles today, but in fact, what pieces are most useful for libraries are all the things that come before circles in restorative practices, especially during the pandemic times. But the goal of restorative practices is to build healthy communities, to increase social capital, decrease crime, antisocial behavior, repair harm. And that's really one of the big focuses, is around repairing harm, restoring relationships. It's at its core a relationship tool between us and our community, us and our patrons. And that means it also requires something of us to engage with it. A few things really. I mean, the first one that's can be tough for some of the staff that we've trained on this is the idea of, you know, how you view yourself as an authority figure. What I mean by that is, do you expect 100% to be respected, or, you know, what are your expectations? I think some of us, we expect people to just follow our direction, and that's not what this does. This works together with a person. It takes a little more time at the get-go to get them to get to the place where we need them to be as a community member. But it's a guidance. It's not like I'm telling you to do this, you need to do it. It's not a directive. And so that's something we have to look at. And then another piece is sometimes it requires some vulnerability on your part, which I think is another thing that can be a little tough. Sometimes it requires you to tell people where you're coming from and what your emotional state is when you're dealing with a problem. And I know that can be a little frightening as well, but it has a big impact when it's, you know, done within the outline of these practices. All right, so why should we use restorative practices in our communities? I think when we're talking about the library, it helps build a community. It helps ensure that people that need to use the library can continue to use it. So a great example for us is, you know, we've had a number of youth, you know, tweens really, who go to our middle schooler. They might cause some problems. And in past times, we might have looked at, you know, okay, we've warned you, you know, 5 times about this issue. We're going to ask you to leave for the day. But instead, we've now gone toward moving toward having more conversations with them and getting them to commit to changes. And it's made a big difference. It helps to build accountability. If someone commits to making their own change, they're more likely to follow through with it than, say, if you're directing them to do something. And it really delivers more permanent solutions to behavior problems that we see. And I think that's the goal, is to, you know, kind of change the expectations, change the feeling between us and the patron, to have us be part of a whole as opposed to two oppositional forces. So success in this case looks like patrons committing themselves to repairing harm, and that we see progressive and lasting behavior changes. And so really the bottom line is that it's easier to condemn someone's behavior and demand they change it than it is to help a person change it. And that's easier at first, is what I should say there, because if we get someone to change fully or even partially, it saves us time in the end. Whereas, you know, a condemnation might be easy. It's like, you know, that whole saying, it's penny wise but pound foolish. And the other piece around this is this is one that was, you know, kind of taught to us by a teacher at the West Ada School District in our community. She said that a lot of times when we look at behavior issues in our facilities, we look at having power over someone, but restorative practices, we try to have power with rather than over. So we have power together in our interaction together, as opposed to, you know, power or authority. And that's a whole different way to look at some of, you know, what we've done in the past. And so I think that that's important. Okay, so if we want to engage with restorative practices, there's a few things that I think that we sometimes need to look at as far as change goes. Giving out directives immediately can be one of those. Expecting that we're absolutely respected without trying to build relationships with people who are our regulars, who are our customers. And that power with other than power over what I mentioned before. Okay. So this is kind of the last little prelude before we get into the nuts and bolts of how this process works. Does it work every time? No. I mean, sometimes you may have an issue that is severe and needs attention immediately, where it may require you to just kick someone out of the library for the day, or suspend someone for a little longer, or in some cases, it may even require bringing in mental health help, or even the police in some cases. But the idea here is that if we can try to nip these things in the bud early, we work as a group, as a community, to solve them, then we have to do those things a lot less. And I think that's really important, because we know some groups in our society have more trouble with police interaction than others, and for reasons of bias, for reasons of racism. And so trying to find ways to reduce the amount of interaction there is another important factor in this, and I think that's important to state here as well. And if we do have trouble, with getting restorative practice to work, sometimes we may need to use directives. Sometimes we may need to just have someone leave, and we can try again the next time they're in. And I think that's the key. Is it's a process over time of building relationships, of making a difference. Okay, so we're going to go over some major components of this. The first one is really one of the most important is relationship building. And this is a simple one, but I think it's just one we have to be intent about and really think about as we're going about our daily work. Using restorative questions. These are kind of phrased in a certain way so that we can get people to think about their impact on the community and others. Using effective statements. These are a little bit of a prompt in a way to kind of get someone to think about how what they're doing might make others feel, or how it might impact others. Using circles. These tend to be most useful in library settings for issues where we have problems over time. We need to sit down and talk with someone to try to get to a kind of a solution. Many of the smaller issues that come up day to day, usually you can get through with restorative questions and effective statements alone. And then encouraging accountability over time. So if we kind of come to a resolution with someone that they say that they're going to make a change, holding them accountable to that. All right, so we're talking about building relationships. A lot of that is just how we interact with our library space and the people that are coming into it. And it means, we got to be present. We got to be moving around our facilities. I know right now that means often staying distant from people that are in your facilities, if you have people in your facilities, if you're open to a degree. And if we see things happening early, it's better to step in than later. So in building relationships, one of the important things is, making sure you're greeting people when they're coming in your building. And that's very simple, but it's actually really important to this process. And then, talking with people on a daily basis, inquiring about their day, how they're doing, especially if they're a regular, and especially if there's someone you see issues with on a day-to-day basis. If you're having a particular patron where you're seeing behavior problems occur on a regular basis, that's the person you really need to reach out to. That's the person you really need to ask about how they're doing today, what's going on in their life, and work on building that rapport. Because the more you have a relationship that, there's some understanding around, the more likely you are to get some give and take in that, where you're able to ask someone to do something, you're able to kind of get a more positive response from someone. And this can take time, but it's probably one of the most critical areas for looking at this process. So another piece of this is, if you've had someone you've been working on with some issues for behavior, it's always important to kind of note positive changes. It's we've had a kid for quite some time who had some problems with scooters in the library. He would, want to ride his scooter in the lobby, and it caused a lot of disruption. It wasn't safe. And then, he started bringing it up to us at the desk to hold for him while he was in, which was something he had, made a solution for himself. And when he did that, we would say, hey, thank you so much for doing this, because it really makes a big difference in, how the library is today, because this one action is a big deal. And, that positive praise for like the good things is as important as the, telling people, hey, this is a problem today. So restorative questions are, and we actually, in Meridian, we have name badges that we wear around our necks. And they got a little like a plastic holder, and we tend to keep a list of restorative questions in there, so that if we have an issue that comes up, we can refer to those pretty quickly. But these questions are meant to kind of get people to think about the impact of behavior on those around them, and get people to kind of take a little bit of a step back and say, okay, well, how is what I'm doing causing a disruption or harming others within the space that I'm using? And a lot of times, we think to ourselves, okay, well, people should just know that that they're being a disruption or that they're causing a problem. But again, back to libraries are for everyone. Not everyone does understand that. And I think that, depending on, what home life might be like, social issues people might have, there may be difficulties in understanding social cues, things of that nature, that mean that not everyone is always completely aware of how their behavior impacts others. And we can be a little bit of a helping hand on that and kind of guide people to it, so that they can get a little bit of a better picture of that, and not in a punitive way. So usually when we want to start having a conversation with a person that maybe is having an issue, maybe they, today, in this day and age, it could be they don't want to wear their mask correctly, or they keep letting it fall below their nose, or it could be, someone being too loud in our computer lab, and we've asked them a few times, hey, do you mind keeping that volume down? Typically we want to start by asking the people to speak away from distractions, so that they have a space where, they're not being overheard by others so much. Just because that means that, the issue of embarrassment or things of that nature are not going to come up as much. Trying to be on equal footing with people is also important. We don't want to tower over somebody if they're like seated. If there's a way to be both seated, that can be a really high benefit, because you can look eye to eye with somebody. And really, just start by being friendly is the best way to go. When we have deal with kids about this, if we're talking about a problem, oftentimes it will start with, hey, talk about, skateboarding or something like that first, because it diffuses the situation a little bit and gets us on, again, more of an equal footing, more of a relationship building footing. Right, so some of the restorative questions that these come from the International Institute of Restorative Practices. This is for, say, what they call someone who may have caused the problem. Tell me a little bit about what happened today. What were you thinking about when this happened? Was anybody affected by the behaviors that you were, exhibiting, or was anybody affected by what you were doing? If they were, like, how? Do you think there's something you can do to make it right today, to fix the problem? And that's really the critical thing we're trying to get to, is someone to arrive at a solution of their own that's amenable to both parties. And if we can do that, they're just so much more likely to stick to it. It may take a few reminders, but if someone is coming up with a solution themselves, as opposed to us enforcing one upon them, they're likely to, internalize that and more likely to make it part of their daily practice as well. So if you have people that maybe were hurt by another person in the library, when I say that, I mean by like harmed by their behavior, either that could be they couldn't work on their resume, or they were bothered by an action, or whatever it may be. The things you can ask them are things like, how did this impact you? What was the hardest thing for you about the situation? What do you think needs to happen to make it right? Now, the thing I'll caution on this is when they use this in schools or other closed communities, typically these questions may be asked in a circle type setting with everyone present, the perpetrator, the person that feels harmed. But in a library setting where not everyone's on the same page about how this all works or what the expectations are, it's not going to be particularly effective. You have a patron who came in from somewhere, and then you have a kid that's from somewhere else. They don't necessarily have as much common ground as a group that might be in a more closed community. So what we typically do is we'll ask questions like this to the person that feels harmed, and we'll act as a proxy for them in a conversation. That way we can kind of relay the impact, but we don't have, say, an adult who says, my solution is that you need to kick all the kids out of this library, because that's not a solution. Sometimes it's good to take notes, just to, especially if you have to talk to multiple people. You may end up being a little bit of a go-between between different folks who are on different sides of the situation. It can be helpful. And sometimes you're talking to, one person one day, another person another day, to kind of track down the loose ends of an incident. And so notes can be helpful with that. Okay, well, what happens if, you're trying to have a conversation, it breaks down? This is liable to break down sometimes. And I think that's the beauty of it, is that because it breaks down once doesn't mean we can't try again. We can't work on that relationship. We can't try to get to a place where now we're feeling more on a mutual footing, and we can try to start resolving some problems. So sometimes, it's a choice of like, hey, we can either have a conversation about this and try to work through it, or maybe you'll have to leave for the day. And given that choice, a conversation may not sound so bad. Sometimes they'll leave, and that's okay, because the next time they're in, you have another opportunity to try to work through some of this. Focus on dealing with the problem at hand using the best available course of action if things break down. So, if it's something that's a big hazard for others, sometimes you just need to shut it down, and you may need to, ask people to leave if necessary. But the goal is, you want to come back to it on the other side. Next time the person's in, you want to have this conversation still. All right, so sometimes you ask restorative questions, you get silence, you get answers that, don't show a lot of analysis as far as, what happened. And that's okay, because that's where effective statements can become really useful. These are another tool that International Institute of Restorative Practices encourages. And they're pretty simple. And I think it's one of the, beyond the building relationships, that honestly are probably the second most important tool in your toolbox as far as getting good outcomes here. Because we're not a closed community like a school. You have people coming and going. That means that sometimes people can just make the choice to leave, or they can make the choice to not engage. And that's, part of their right as a, community member that maybe is just coming or going from the library. That's where effective statements can be really helpful. And they're basically set up this way, when you do X, it makes others feel Y. So when you're loud in the computer lab, it makes it hard for others to focus on their work. When you throw things in the library, it makes other people worry about their safety because they might get hit. Now this is where your vulnerability can come in. Again, not everyone's favorite thing to try to be vulnerable in front of a patron, but I've really found that this can make a huge difference sometimes, especially when it's starting to break down and you're not getting someone to engage with you. I'll give a little story in a minute here, but when you do X, it makes me feel Y. When I have to come over and talk to you over and over again about the noise you're making, it makes me feel hurt because I feel like you just don't care what I have to say. That's a little bit vulnerable. But often when it's phrased in that they're actually maybe causing us some harm to you, people are less willing to continue doing the thing that's harming you. I'll give you an example of this. So I have a kid that I've worked with for quite some time, and he has a number of behavior issues, and he's got a really rough home life. And a lot of that is, why the behaviors come out when he's at the library. And we've worked through him on lots of things, like the noise issues in the lab, threatening other kids sometimes, using some inappropriate language, a few different things. And I had one day where, he was very upset. He had a bad day at school. He didn't want to, because he'd gotten suspended from school. He didn't want to engage with me. We were having some issues with problems in the lab from him, just kind of yelling, cursing when he was at the computer. So we had stepped aside just to chat for a bit, and he just wasn't wanting to engage. And this is a kid we've worked with for some time. Like we've, before we started using restorative practices, we would have just suspended him. We probably suspended him a few times before we started doing it. And he's one of the things that made me realize this is not working. And so with him a day when he just didn't want to engage with me, we didn't want to talk through the issues, I said to him, hey, when you just don't want to engage with me, it makes me feel hurt because I've been working so hard to make sure you can stay in here in the library. And, we have, some issues that have been going on. And I think that if we don't resolve them, it just makes me feel really bad. And that kind of made him take a step back and think, okay, because we've been working together closely on these things for so long, like, he doesn't want to make me feel bad, and he was. And so I think that's an important thing to think about when you think about vulnerability, is it can have an impact if you are willing to share a little bit of your feelings about situations that you're enduring. And I think it's a really hard one because it's opening yourself up a bit. And, I know one of the fears around opening yourself up is that maybe someone might take advantage of that. So, you have to look at the situation, the person you're working with, what the risks are. But in some cases, it can be a game changer for how somebody works with you. All right, so anytime we're having a conversation, anytime we're trying to work through a problem, our end goal is to try to get a way forward where the person can commit to helping out with the situation, to making something better. So, questions, if we're having a small impromptu chat where we're asking some restorative questions, where we're using some effective statements, we can get to the point where we can say, hey, well, what are you able to do for me to help make this situation better? What are you able to do to kind of fix the problems that are happening right now? And the goal is we want people to come up with their own solutions because they're much more likely to hold to them. The ones that I have listed here on the slide, I can work on being quieter in the library. I can bring my scooter up to the desk when I come in. These are simple things, but both of these are things that, came out of the mouths of kids. These are not just inventions or examples. They're like things that kids came up with themselves. And I can think of like dozens of other ones that were helpful. And then once they have come up with a solution that's amenable to us and the community that we're working in, then it means it's much easier to enforce their own rule upon themselves than it is for us to enforce our rules upon them, if that makes sense. So sometimes it requires us to think, okay, well, we know we might have this happen again. Like, if you're talking about volume levels or things like that, a middle schooler, it might have trouble another day, and that's fine. We can expect that. We can come up with solutions to that too. What should happen if you can't be quieter in the lab, or say I've warned you a couple times in a day and you still aren't being quiet? What do you think we should do? I'll have to get off the computer for the rest of the day. Again, a solution that a kid came up with for themselves. All right, so shockingly, this is the one guy who is available for Creative Commons use with his mask below his nose. I expect there would be more by now. But just a scenario of one we probably deal with if you're open to some degree. You have, patrons that sort of follow mask guidelines or don't. Here in Meridian, we kind of pretty strictly enforce it. We make sure people have their masks above their nose and are wearing them properly. But it happens that someone doesn't want to do it, or we've asked them a couple of times to please keep it up, and they let it drop again, and they just kind of seem resistant to the policy. So in cases like this, especially here in our COVID era, we certainly want to try to keep our distance, because that's important for health and safety. But we can use things like our questions and our effective statements to help deal with this issue. So one that I found most useful here is probably just using the effective statements. When you keep letting your mask fall below your nose, it's making others feel unsafe, and really honestly, it's making me feel unsafe too. Would you mind please pulling it back up? Or is there anything you can do to help with this situation? If we can get people to kind of think about it from others' perspectives a little bit, that can often help. Now, I know that there's those out there that are just here to kind of protest the wearing a mask generally. But then we can also give them some choices in the matter, like hey, do you want to have a talk about this, or would you prefer having to leave the library for the day? And this is a struggle, because it seems in many cases higher stakes than some of the other issues we deal with around behavior, because it's a safety issue and we don't feel alarmed by it in many cases. But we have to continue to kind of think through our lens of empathy and our lens of repairing harm, rather than that directive method, if we can, because I think that's going to lead to better outcomes in the long term, especially if we have someone that we see come in multiple days and have the same problem. All right, so this one is something, of course, like we have dealt with lots of times in my library. Just being located across the street from middle school, we have like some gravel out front. Kids throw rocks at each other. Kids throw backpacks at each other. We give snacks sometimes. They throw the snacks at each other. So we try to put it with them. We try to ask, hey, how do you think that throwing the objects is affecting other people around you? And often they know, they can think it through real quickly. And then we can say, okay, well, what do you think you can do to change that? Or if they don't want to be forthcoming about it, then maybe it's, well, when you're throwing the rocks, people feel unsafe. Or you can even give a particular example. When you were throwing that rock, there was like a little kid coming into the building, and the parent looked really worried. That can really help too, to get people to kind of see what's happening. And then it's a matter of, hey, well, what do you think you can do to change the behavior that you're, this behavior right now? Or what do you think you can do to make this a little bit better? And usually the simple answer is not throw rocks. And that seems simple, but having them say it versus you makes all the difference in the world in most cases. All right, so I'm going to spend a little time on the idea of circles, and then I'm going to have time for questions and all that. I just kind of wanted to go through all this real quick because they're so interconnected that, you know, having the whole picture might help with what questions you have down at the end. So circles are kind of one of the core constituencies of how this is used in schools or other communities. It's a little less important, say, in the library setting than some of the other factors, but it can be very useful. And usually it's for some of our harder situations or things we've seen as a problem over time. And you want to sit, you know, obviously pretty far apart today, but, you know, looking at each other. Once we get past COVID, you know, that can be, you know, in a room, whatever, and one person speaks at a time. It can be kind of formal or informal, but the goals are you want to resolve a problem that's, you know, been causing harm over time and express the harm that's been caused. So some of these that I've done with my staff and patrons have been, we'll have an issue that's been kind of a problem through time or kind of a bigger issue that came up. Like we had a kid do some damage to one of our library vehicles. They had like broken a mirror on it because they were upset about something that had happened in the building. So what we typically will do is we'll have like the staff member who dealt with that problem and then like a manager sit in as well. And that staff member can be the proxy for the harm caused. Either they received a call of complaint from a patron or they received the patron complaint about the issue. And they can kind of relay how that patron felt, how they felt having to receive that, even tell them, you know, how much time all of this took, you know, filing an incident report, you know, talking with your manager, all this stuff that, you know, may take time can be important to relay as well. And so with a circle, you typically want to start, you know, again, start light with, you know, a little bit of ice breaking. How are you today? What have you been up to? Some chit chat, and then we get down to business. So, hey, do you remember this thing that happened the other day when we had one of our mirrors on our van broken? Do you remember what happened there? And you give them some space to kind of tell their side of the story. You know, ask some questions about how that might have impacted others. Use this restorative questions. And then, you know, we can have our proxy who's there, the staff member, talk a little bit about how that affected them. And that can be something like, you know, when I had to deal with that situation, it was incredibly stressful. And now the library is not able to use that vehicle. We need it to make deliveries. We have to go get it fixed. And then coming to the solution piece at the end, which is like, well, okay, given what you've heard from our staff member and what you've thought about, you know, this thing that happened, what do you think you might be able to do to fix this? And the answer in this case was, oh, well, I'll work to pay it off. I'll get the money for it. So, and the great thing is there, like, this was a, you know, like a petty crime, but no one was, you know, physically hurt by it. And the library did get reimbursed, but we did not have to involve the police. We got to resolve it through a restorative method instead of through this. And I think it was a better outcome. It didn't go on someone's permanent record. We did get commitment on some behavior change and, you know, some things we needed to for them to return to using the library. But it meant, you know, a better community outcome, I think, than just getting them into the juvenile system. Right, so after you have come up with a solution with someone, they've kind of given you an idea of how they can commit to change. You want to make sure that that gets communicated with people you work with at your location. Hey, so-and-so said they're not going to bring their play with their scooter in the library anymore. So if you see it, make sure you ask him about what he committed to, so you can get him to hold true to that. And then when you see them in the building, if they're doing good, make sure you tell them they're doing good. And if they're not doing it, then it's a simple statement like, do you remember last week you said you wanted to work on maintaining a lower volume in the lab? And they'll say, yeah, or, and then you can get them to kind of recall what they had said, reflect on what they're currently doing. And because it's something they come up with and not you just telling them, they're just a lot more likely to follow through with it. Some other examples. Do you remember what you were going to do in regards to your scooter in the library? Based on our previous conversations, this seems like it might be a good time for you to walk away from this conflict. That's a case where we had a kid who would get in big arguments or almost physical altercations with people over, stuff that was happening with other kids in the building. So that's kind of the procedures that we try to use here in Meridian. I'll recommend some further reading. Probably one of the most helpful books for me in this was this Restorative Practices Handbook. It's directed at schools, but there's so much that can be adapted for libraries from it. And I mentioned these cards. They're really helpful just as a tool to keep near you when you are dealing with behavior issues, especially if you have to deal with them regularly. And help you kind of take a step back, think through like, how are you going to approach this thing? What questions are you going to ask? Instead of just going straight to the directive, which is often the most natural thing to do. And with that, I'm going to just open it up for some questions. Thank you all for spending some time listening to me talk about this. It's something I'm really passionate about. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. While folks are typing in your questions, we had a couple come in while you were talking. So one of them was, what does it look like to stop giving directives? And could you give some more examples of that?
Right. So what that looks like is, it's almost like when you think about de-escalation, it's time and space, right? It says take more time, but it means starting with either a statement about how it's impacting others, or starting with a question about, hey, what's happening right now, and what do you think that's doing as far as impacting others in the space? So we're trying to get people to come around to their own realization of this. And I know that takes like 4 steps where it seems like just telling someone to stop doing something can take 1. And sometimes it is necessary to say, you got to stop doing that because it's dangerous or someone could get harmed. But in many of the situations we deal with, it can be a disruption. It can be something that, is making it hard to do our jobs. It's making it hard for others to work. In a lot of those situations, we do have the time and space to try to work through these things in a restorative way rather than just telling someone, hey, don't do this. Hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great. So the next one is kind of a comment, but also a question, and I think is getting at something that's really relevant right now. So June was responding to the scenario of the patron with a mask under their nose. And she said that she felt much safer at work once she was given the ability to directly say, you're going to be asked to leave, rather than sort of endlessly pleading with people. And so I guess the question is, like, where is that sweet spot of giving folks a lot of leeway, but then also holding the line?
Yeah, I think June makes a great point, because it's a really tough reality that we are dealing with right now as far as that goes. But I think I just want to encourage people to think about it. Let's think about this long term, right? Like, yes, we do want to give that ultimatum, but for me, and I just did a training with staff on this morning, it should be like probably the third or fourth step as opposed to the first one. Because we also have to think about our libraries as communities. And I know that's tougher today than it maybe has been in my memory. You know, I've almost been in libraries for 20 years now. But we have to think about how are we going to maintain that community feeling. And that means even these people that struggle with this mask ordinances and things like that, they're part of our community. And if we can get them to come around a little bit to at least understanding why it's important, it creates more lasting change versus, you know, just the immediate removal of the problem. Now, sometimes the immediate removal of the problem is important and it's the right way to go. And I think, you know, part of that is how safely can you do this? Some of it's your comfort level. But for me, you know, I feel like the first is a please. The second is this is impacting others this way. The third is, you know, maybe try to appeal to some of their value systems. You know, we're trying to preserve the freedom of others in the community to move freely by making sure we follow this mask mandate. We're just trying to make sure we keep things open, you know, because you know, they're worried about that, right? And then the last thing can be like, if you can't do this, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave. I don't know. That's my opinion of it. I found that the appealing to the values can work really well in many cases too. So that's a nice little tool that I recommend personally.
Great, thank you for that. We've had a couple questions about how a library with many different staff working at different shift times, how do those staff members share information about patrons and their behaviors?
That's a great question. I think there's like obviously some tricky issues in that, right? Because there's patron privacy involved. And then there's also like the effectiveness of kind of doing some of these restorative practices that lead to behavior modifications. So typically what we will do is if we have come up with some kind of agreement with one of our patrons, whether that be like they've agreed to do X, Y, or Z, they said they would, you know, bring their scooter up every day. With those, which we typically want to get an email out to all the location staff that, you know, work on those public desks to kind of let them know, hey, so and so has agreed that, you know, in light of the issue we had the other day, that they're going to make sure that they do this thing. And we want to make sure we keep that internal. We're not talking about patrons, you know, behind their back and things like that. But we do have to share some information in order to make this work, in order to keep people accountable long term. It's an important factor in this, because if we come up with an agreement and then we never talk to them about it again, if problems arise, then it just kind of falls apart. I hope that helps.
Definitely. So how would you approach an issue when one party just doesn't want to participate in the conversation?
Yeah, and that happens, especially with middle schoolers, I'll tell you. It's not uncommon. So, you know, first you try, and then you can give like an ultimatum, like was mentioned about the mask thing. You know, hey, if you don't want to talk to me today about this issue, let's see if we can come to a resolution. I'm gonna just have to ask you to leave for the afternoon, and give someone a choice in the matter. Again, giving someone a choice, just like having them come up with their own solution, is better than you just telling them, because then it becomes something more that they had a say in, rather than that they just had foisted upon them. It makes a difference. I mean, and the other piece is coming back. Like, if you have a situation, especially if it's one of your regulars, where they are, problem happens one day, they don't want to talk about it, they end up taking off, or you end up having to ask them to leave. well, if you see them again, say hello, be kind, and then, maybe after they've, been in the library a few minutes, or, go up and talk and say, hey, remember yesterday? Seems like we had some trouble there. Would you mind talking about it for a little bit? Seeing if you can get there again. Because, again, it's that time and space thing with de-escalation. Like a day has gone by, maybe it's escalated enough for them that they might be willing to talk it through on the second day, or, a few days later if you see them.
So who do you suggest should speak to patrons who are exhibiting some problem behaviors? Like, for example, should it be frontline staff? Should they loop in a manager or a supervisor? What are your thoughts?
Well, here we've done training for all of our frontline staff on these practices, and so make it kind of an expectation that they can at least do the beginning parts of this. Try to use some of the effective statements, ask some of the questions. It really helps if frontline staff can be engaged with this process, because they see patrons more than the manager will, and it's just a frank and honest fact. And so their opportunities to build relationships are much higher. So to me, getting buy-in and involving frontline staff in this, it can be really important. And it's not how we started. And so maybe it's not how you'll want to start if you want to try this out. We started, just kind of using disciplinary circles to deal with like sort of intransigent problems that we would have over time, where like, the same behaviors were coming up over weeks, and trying to kind of get resolution for those. And that was a good first way to start, because, it kind of pointed out the effectiveness of some of the tools. And I think that was important for gaining traction with the staff to be willing to try some of this. Because we actually did see behavior change, and we can kind of point to it and use it as a case in point. So sometimes a scale, like, a phased rollout of this can be helpful, I think. I mean, for us, it made a difference. So.
Got a good question for you. So what happens if the patron, for example, might be on the autism spectrum and finds it a little bit harder to control their behavior that affects others in the library?
Right. So I think it's important. Empathy is really important with this. And again, we're meeting people where they are. And so I think it's important to, like, if we can try to make people understand where we're coming from, great. But sometimes, it may not be possible for that to happen. And I think that we want to find ways to find solutions that allow people to stay within the building. And sometimes that means a little extra work on our part. I know we certainly had some of this happen with some of our youth programs, and some of that was like, okay, well, let's work with the caretaker or the parent on this and see what solutions might be available for them if we're having trouble communicating with the person that's on the spectrum. And that can be helpful. I mean, certainly that's not the first thing you want to do. You want to, like, try to, if you can engage with the person who's causing the problem, that's the goal. But restorative practices sometimes can use proxies to get to the point where we need to be. And I mean, certainly I've worked with a number of parents on issues like this, from things like, a child who had, some trouble in programs with overstimulation, and would often have, kind of a breakdown. And like, how could we make that communication work better? And so we developed things like, okay, well, we have a kind of a emotions chart we can use, and we can put in the room, and they can kind of point to some of the things that they're feeling or things that they need, so that, if they're unable to verbalize it, then they have another method of communicating and kind of letting people know where they're at. Or, we had an issue of some inappropriate behavior in one of our labs from an adult with developmental disabilities. And in that case, we worked with his parents to kind of come up with a solution that they thought was amenable to the problem that happened. And I think it was good because it was a mutually found solution that, recognized how important the library was to him, but also how important it was to correct the behavior issue that we were seeing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for answering all of our questions. I think we had one left, and it was just specific about the library vehicle situation that you described. They just wanted to know if the parents were invited to sit in during those discussions, or if they were left out of that process.
The parents were involved in that discussion.
Oh, looks like there's a couple more in the chat. Okay, there's been a lot of criticism in recent years of the toll that emotional labor takes on workers, often without additional compensation. So how do we ensure that this restorative model doesn't contribute to burnout?
I think that's a really good question. And I think that's probably one I need to think through more too, if I'm perfectly honest. But it is an emotional, it does take some emotional work to operate this way. And I'll be honest to say that. I think one of the important things that we've tried to do for our staff is, make sure that we have clear guidelines, but we also have, space to kind of talk about what they're feeling, which is, also kind of a part of a part of restorative practices too. This can be used as a way to run a workplace as well. And some staff were, better equipped to work this way than others. And I think that giving people time and space to kind of recuperate is really important if they've had a really tough interaction or an issue that made it difficult. And also trying to resolve systemic problems about why some of these things happen was another thing for us that was really important. With our location across from a middle school, it means that after school, the staff that work that shift, they're just constantly working on this stuff, and it can be hard. So part of the solution to that was okay, well, it's not just the issue of the staff or the patrons. It's okay, well, what are we doing after school, and does it make sense for this audience? And we needed to redesign the service model for our middle school population and make it a little more useful to them, so they actually want to engage with kind of programming and other things that we're doing after school. We had an after school space, but it wasn't being used. And so we needed to take a step back and say, okay, well, how do we make sure that the majority of our middle schoolers want to use this space after school, and that they feel engaged and they're having fun, and they're less likely to cause issues over time. So I don't know if that fully answers that question, but it's just a little bit of speaking from the experience of Meridian. Something definitely to think about.
Yeah, that's great. And that's why we invited you here, is for you to share your expertise and your experience. So thank you so much, John, for presenting today. It's been fabulous. And thank you so much, all of the attendees, for listening and all of your great questions. If you will receive an email with a link to the recording to this, plus any links to slides or handouts we might have, and a survey. And it's been super great